See, unlike the US government, for us, the regular folks, when we reach our credit card threshold, we have limited options. Either borrow more money and pay down the credit card, which makes matters worse since borrowing gets us into more debt, or find a way to increase our income to finance our expenses. You can't simply increase your credit card limit and continue spending without making payments because if you don't pay your debt, your creditworthiness decline and no bank will be willing to issue you more credit. The same applies to any business. If a company spends aggressively accumulating debt that outpaces revenue, sooner or later that company will go bankrupt. That's not the case with the government. The same government that spends recklessly also has the power to increase its debt limit, which suggests that a real debt limit doesn't even exist, and if it does, it serves no purpose. But debt is debt nonetheless, and whether you are government or an average citizen, the consequences of it can be disastrous, especially if it's debt that's spiraled out of control. What's going on, guys? Welcome back, and in today's video we will talk about government debts and what happens when the US hits its debt ceiling. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. One like equals $1 trillion increase in debt limit. Let's begin. You heard it on the news recently. The US has reached its $31.4 trillion debt limit. And you asked yourself, what is exactly debt limit? Why does it exist? How did we get here? And what happens when the US hits its debt ceiling? By the way, to give you a perspective on how big the 31.4 trillion number is, imagine if you have 31.4 trillion seconds. How many years would that be? The number is 995,687 years. In other words, the number 31.4 trillion is so huge that it's even hard for our brains to comprehend it. The debt limit, also known as the debt ceiling, is the total amount of money that the US government is authorized to borrow in order to finance its budget deficits. Now, here's the secret. Just because there is a debt limit doesn't mean it limits the government from spending. Confusing, right? Ray Dalio in his recent LinkedIn post described it best. It's a farce that works like a bunch of alcoholics who write laws to enforce drinking limits, and when a limit is reached, they do farcical negotiations that temporarily eliminates the limit, which allows them to have the next drinking binge until they reach the next limit, at which time they go through the same farcical negotiations and continue to binge. Simply put, every time the US government reaches its debt limit, Congress simply votes to increase the debt ceiling and the show goes on. Works like a magic trick. The US government has been raising the debt limit threshold since 1917. In fact, since 1960, Congress has increased the ceiling 78 times. Republicans have done it 49 times and Democrats have done it 29 times. As of December 2021, the debt limit was set at $31.4 trillion, which was just reached as of January 19th and growing daily because our country has failed to live within its means for too long. Ron Elvin from NPR in his recent article gives us a good rundown of the debt ever since it surpassed the $1 trillion mark. The limit and the debt near the $1 trillion level for the first time in the late 1970s. Ronald Reagan made that a major campaign issue in 1980, but while he was in the office, the limit was raised more than a dozen times and reached $2.8 trillion. In 1990, under President George H.W. Bush, the limit was set to more than $4 trillion, making the 1980s the decade with the biggest percentage increase in the debt and the debt limit. Under Bill Clinton, the limit went to about $6 trillion in 1997, and under George W. Bush to roughly $11 trillion in 2008. The last time the new limit was set under Obama, it was $18 trillion in 2015, and the last time under Donald Trump, it went to $22 trillion in March 2019. Thereafter, in the pandemic, Congress suspended the limit to spend without any minimal restraints. The debt rose to more than $27 trillion. The current limit set in 2021 is $31.4 trillion. The US government has run a deficit averaging nearly $1 trillion ever since 2001, meaning that it spends that much more money than it receives through taxes and other revenue. To make up the difference, it has to borrow to continue to finance payments that Congress has already authorized. That's right, Congress first authorizes spending and only after it tries to figure out how to pay for it. The debt limit is not about spending in the future, it's about owning up to the past, paying the bill that has arrived from previous purchases and commitments. When the US hits its debt limits, there are only two options. Congress can raise the limit, which they have always done, or the government faces a default situation. The US government has never defaulted on its debt, but if it were to do so, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not only would the value of US bonds, a safe haven for investors, take a huge hit, but it could cause a global economic meltdown. We would have an immediate recession, the role of dollar globally would weaken most likely permanently. Over half of the world's foreign currency reserves are held in US dollars. Interest rates for the government and everyone else would rise significantly. The US credit rating would tank, resulting in much higher borrowing costs. Government programs like Social Security and Medicare would be impaired. Maintaining a national defense would be at risk. These are a few reasons why the US government has never defaulted on its debt. It's much easier to increase the debt limits than to deal with harsh consequences of debt, but but that's not to say that raising the debt ceiling is a better option. Doing so gives us enough rope to hang ourselves if we don't do anything about deficit spending. As I mentioned earlier, we have already reached the debt limit. When that happens, the Treasury Department can stave off a default for several months with a series of temporary extraordinary measures. These include suspending payments to some government employee savings programs, underinvesting in certain government funds, and so on. The Treasury Department can only buy so much time though. So far, these extraordinary measures can keep the government afloat till June. In the meantime, Congress must act to raise the debt ceiling. If it does not, then US will default on its debt obligations and financial crisis, unlike anything we have seen before, could unfold. As we are recording this video, the White House and Congress are still negotiating the debt limits, and so far it has been quite the comedy, as it always has. The circus is in town and the clowns must play their parts, even though everyone knows how the show ends. During this political theater, things usually follow a routine path. You have politicians making soul-wrenching speeches about how America should spend within its means and how accumulating more debt will burden future generations. After some wrangling, Congress eventually agrees to increase or even suspend the debt ceiling. As I mentioned earlier, the debt limit is not so much about tackling nations' debt or spending habits as it is about two different political parties going at each other and who could get a better political gain. Today, Republican majority House is holding the debt limit hostage, refusing to increase it unless the Biden administration agrees to a set of concessions. A similar episode comes to mind when in 2011, under President Barack Obama, Democrats and Republicans were caught in a deadlock over increasing the debt limits. Obama ended up negotiating with White House Republicans, eventually producing a new law called the Budget Control Act. Even though a deal to raise the limit was reached just 2 days before the anticipated date of default, it was enough for a credit rating agency, S&P Global Ratings, to downgrade the US credit rating for the first time in history, driving up borrowing costs by about $1.3 billion in that fiscal year. That's all I have for you today, and as always, feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below. Will Congress increase the debt ceiling, suspend it, or embrace a default? I think we all know the outcome, but I would love to hear your take. Stay safe and stay informed. Till next time.